And we will start in just a moment. All right. I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. And here we go. All right, thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar Trail Planning and Design, Foundations of Success. My name is Candice Gallagher and I am the Director of Operations and Webinar Coordinator for American Trails. This is our 219th webinar in the American Trails Advancing Trails webinar series, and this is the second of 4 webinars that we are hosting this fall and winter in partnership with the Professional TrailBuilders Association. And this webinar, we have a lot of new people on. This webinar is being recorded. It includes real-time closed captioning in English and also offers free learning credits. And you will see links for the closed captioning, the learning credit quiz, as well as the survey in the chat box. And attendees will also receive a follow-up email from me within 2 days with the link to the recording, the transcript, the resources slide with the presenter emails, as well as other links and learning credit details. And I would like to thank our generous sponsor of today's webinar, Mass Trails, as well as our additional webinar partners that include Camelot Tools, Doctors Elizabeth and Greg Berger, Poly Products, the Trails Safe Passing Plan Stop, Speak, and Stand Back, Black Diamond Trail Designs, Presto Geosystems, Outer Spatial, as well as our federal agency partners, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the USDA Forest Service. And I'm happy to introduce our presenters for today. We have Erin Kay, who is the Executive Director with the Professional TrailBuilders Association. We also have John Atchfield, who's the founder and principal with Chinook Landscape Architecture, as well as Jeremy Wimpy, who is principal with Applied Trails Research. So I'm excited to pass controls over to Erin to kick things off.
Thanks, Candice. We're excited to partner with American Trails on another webinar, and I'm pleased to introduce our 2 speakers. John Atchfield is a landscape architect and the founder and principal of Chinook Landscape Architecture. He specializes in trail planning and design, as well as integrating emerging technologies like drones and 3D modeling. He's also the author of Drone Technology in Architecture, Engineering, and Construction, available on Amazon. And also, Chinook is a member of PTBA. And Dr. Jeremy Wimpy, he is the principal and founder of Applied Trails Research. He's a geographer by training. He supports sustainable trail system development and management. His applied field investigations focus on visitor use-related impacts to wildlife, water, vegetation, soils, as well as the impacts to other recreationists. And he works with the National Scenic and Historic Trails on visitor use management. Just quick about PTBA. We're the trade association for the trail industry. We represent private sector companies who specialize in trail design, planning, and construction. And every PTBA member is professionally vetted through portfolio submission and peer review before they're allowed to join the PTBA membership, which right now we're at 126 member companies worldwide, most of which are in North America, as you can see. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Candice and American Trails for hosting this. We've got 3 main sections that we're going to go through today. We're going to briefly touch on organizational foundations for successful trail planning and design. John's going to talk to you about some tools and technologies that are leveraged in successful projects in the planning and design phases of those. And then we're going to kind of circle back to the life cycle processes of successful trail planning and design and implementation efforts. We also have a couple slides at the end where we're going to talk about 2 different projects at kind of 2 different scales of implementation and highlight some of the organizational and process that went into those. So with that, we're going to jump straight into organizational needs, and we will have question and answer at the end, as well as the live question and answer as we go here. So starting with kind of the foundations of like an organizational or partnership and the needs in that space, we typically can group these into these 4 categories, and we'll talk about those in a bit more detail on the next couple slides. But looking at what kind of organizational resources we have, how are those coordinated, and how do we do that successfully through communication, and also recognizing that trail projects often are can be everything from a short trail reroute or replacing a structure on a trail bridge or a piece of a trail that needs rebuilt, or they can be large, system-wide trail system development or redevelopment projects. And so scaling your resources, the coordination, the communication are inherent in this as well. Next slide. So we think about resources at the kind of organizational level as being our tools that we have in our toolbox. These include people. Importantly, they include our landscapes, so the terrain, the hydrology, the soils, the land ownership status. Are they public lands, private lands? What kind of mix of those ownership or land managing entities are involved in the project? Often we talk about resources such as capital and link that closely to like the fundraising that goes along with, whether that's grants or private fundraising for implementation of trail projects. And we can look at these folks or look at all of these ingredients that become our resources: the land, the people, the ability of the organization to fundraise and operate fiscally responsibly through the implementation phase. We can look at that collectively as experience. The Forest Service and others talk a lot about knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, but collectively, looking at who do you have, what tools do you have? You can have like we have here in the photo, you can have all the sharpest and newest and best trail construction tools in the world, but if you don't have volunteers or folks with the experience and the skills to use those properly with the land managing partner, you're not going to end up with a highly successful project. Next slide. Along with all those resources, thinking about coordination across projects. So if we're working with public land managers, making sure that we're engaging with them, if we're coming at this from a nonprofit or a user community side of things, or vice versa. If you're a land managing partner on here today, thinking about how you coordinate. We recognize that most public lands don't have the budgets to do in-house trail construction and trail management. We constantly are having kind of shortfalls in that area. We rely a lot across the public-private partnership space in the management and development and care of trails. So we want to be able to coordinate that well. Depending on the scale of our project, there may be regulatory space, something like the National Environmental Policy Act, that requires us to seek public input and comment on a trail project. On the smaller scale, there might be need to inform the public for safety issues, that there's trail work going on and the trail's going to be closed for a duration, et cetera. So coordinating that and having plans in place to coordinate that are kind of foundational organizationally to these projects and these projects moving smoothly. As well as engagement across user communities. Sometimes we see, a conservation group or a single-use user community come into a public land manager wanting to push a project forward and develop that project. And so making sure that early in the project, there's coordination, reaching out to the other user communities or the other side of the conservation equation, and making sure that there's ample opportunity to engage around that. And then finally, a pitfall that we'll talk about as we look at life cycles that a lot of projects do run into, unfortunately, is regulatory and permitting office compliance. So coordinating early in your project with the land manager and the state, the local, or the federal agencies, they're going to be overseeing your project, to understand their requirements in that regulatory space is really important. And next slide. And we do a lot of that coordination through communications. These are obviously internal and external within your group or external to your group and across to your land manager. But these communications, when done well, lead to successful fundraising. They lead to broader awareness of projects' existence and the needs or the goals for the projects, and communicating those can have kind of reinforcing effects in the fundraising space as well as the political space if there's a need for that. And we'll see that on some of the example projects we talk about at the end here. The example photo here, this is a group out of near Baltimore, Maryland, with the Friends of Patapsco Valley State Park, a relatively new nonprofit friends group, focuses a lot on trails and recreation, but it's a broad friends group for the whole entirety of that specific park. But one of their events, they do, 2.5-hour fundraiser once a year. And I think they do quite a significant amount of their fundraising and as well as their communication and networking out into the philanthropy world with this single event once a year. Next slide. And then finally, scaling for success. So one of the lessons we hope we can share here today is that taking on projects that are well matched to the existing resources, communication tools, and coordination level that you're able to take on as a land manager or with a set of partners, take those on, walk, and then learn to run. So don't try and eat the whole elephant at once, but build your skill set and scale the size and the types of projects that you take on to match your knowledge and your experience level, because ultimately these projects are places where There's a lot of good public will around trail improvements and outdoor recreation in general, as we saw with the uptick of use through the pandemic. But having success at a smaller scale really helps you build those skills, stretch your capacity, and hopefully attract more folks that'll help contribute, whether it's financially or as a volunteer or as a land manager that builds that relationship with you. Because really a successful project can be phased out and creates this gravity for further and continued success. Great, and I'm going to hand it over to John. He's going to talk us through some planning tools and techniques that are often used on these projects.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so next section, as he mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the tools and techniques. When we talk about this, I always like to begin the discussion with this simple toolbox graphic, because when we look at our projects, there's all sorts of different tools that we use. If we go to the next slide, this is just a handful of some of the tools we use. A lot of these are software ones, but there's all sorts of physical tools, drones and measuring wheels and inclinometers, all sorts of things we use. And every planning and design project is different. So I always like to teach that to be effective, you have to really look at the end goals of the project in order to determine which tools and which techniques you'll use for each one. Every project's going to be different. Some you'll use every one of them. A lot of them you're going to be combining different tools, but not using every tool in your toolbox. When we talk about the tools, I generally separate them into these three categories: data collection, design and mapping, and presentation and sharing. Design is an iterative process. We go back and forth. It's almost like a circle, but generally this is the chronological order. We're collecting data, we're doing mapping and design, and then we have to share that design and mapping and data collection with clients or stakeholders. Slide. So we'll start with talking about data collection tools, and this is usually where the project begins. Some of it's in the office, a lot of it's in the field, but online data sources, field instruments, GPS and phone apps, drones, they're all different tools that we use. So to go through a few of them, we'll start with online data sources. GIS data is typically the online data that we're collecting, although there are other kinds as well. But aerial imagery, property lines, contours, digital elevation maps, existing trails, roads, rivers, lakes, floodplains. Those are all examples of GIS data that you can find online, can download, gives you a much better idea of the property before you ever get on site. A lot of them you're bringing into QGIS or ArcGIS Pro, but a lot of the simpler ones you can bring into Google Earth and be able to view and start doing some preliminary planning or site assessment. So again, the goal with this online data is to understand a site enough to prepare scope and fees, or to be better prepared when you do go out to the field. Next slide. A lot of these are free, really good sources for online data. Earth Explorer is a really good one in the US, but you can also look at Council of Governments, county assessors, other government agencies. A lot of these data sources are already available, at least at a lower resolution online. Once we get out into the field, there's a variety of instruments we use as well. Inclinometers or clinos are one of the first ones we use, and we use them all the way through final design. So a good rule of thumb is don't trust a trail builder or planner who doesn't use a clino. This is really the best way in the field to understand the trail that you're designing, if it matches the desired grades and sustainable grades for design. Other instruments we use: laser rangefinders, handheld GPS, which is on our phones a lot of the time now, measuring wheels, tape measures. We use some little things for measuring the slopes of technical trail features, things like that. All really good tools that, depending on the project, you're likely to use. Next slide. GPS and phone apps. I mentioned handheld GPS. At this point, phones have really good GPS, pretty comparable to a lot of the handheld GPSs, unless you're getting into very expensive equipment. And so we use handheld GPS through our phone on pretty much every project we work on. There's a lot of different apps you can use with different functionalities. OnX, there's a lot of GIS specific ones like Survey 123, Field Maps. Field Maps is what ArcGIS Collector is now called. I'm just going to talk a little bit about OnX on the next slide here. So OnX, there's a variety of apps that do the same thing. Avenza is another one. But the main thing we're trying to do is be able to go back and forth between GIS data in the office and collecting data in the field. So for this property, we're able to do conceptual planning of trails, and this is a few steps down the line what we're seeing here, but we can bring our GIS lines from the office, bring them into OnX, and be able to view this in the field. Then while in the field, we can take geotagged photos and notes. We can track new lines that we're walking and designing. And then it's iterative. We can go back to the office and be bringing that into GIS to revise our design. On the next slide, I have a couple phone screenshots of On-It. Finger idea. So when we're 3 or 4 people standing in the field, we can look at our concept that we were doing. We can see what we've been tracking, and just with our finger, we can start saying, okay, this trail doesn't make sense because of these constraints. Let's cross that out. But big picture wise, we still need to connect to these other control points. How can we do that? And just with our finger, really quickly start to sketch things out in the field. Slide. Drones. So I'm well known for drones, so always have to talk about drones typically. When we talk about drone data collection, there's a few different ways that we can use drones. And I typically separate it into 3 different categories. And those are at the bottom, collecting photos and videos. Next tier up is collecting 3D data. And then at the top is collecting and working with the 3D data. All 3 are great tools, great uses of drones for trail planning and design. The only reason we do this pyramid is the bottom one is very low cost of entry in terms of time and money and learning. So there's lots of people that do it. Next tier up takes a lot more expertise. So there's less people, but still a lot of people doing it. And then at the top, it requires even more expertise in a variety of fields. So there's less people that are both collecting and working with the data. I'm going to go through each of these pretty briefly today. And there's a wealth of information out there. Feel free to reach out to me after the webinar as well if you want more. So next slide, the first tier, photos and videos. Again, low cost of entry in terms of training, time, money. Photos and videos are typically geotagged, can cover a ton of ground quickly, and you get a much better overall perspective of the site you're working on and also the larger context. Next slide. Again, the photos are geotagged. The other nice thing is you can pull the flight logs. So if you're flying roughly the quarter that you want a trail or that there's an existing trail, you can pull those flight logs into GIS, or this is Google Earth screenshots here. So you can get a lot of data that's actually geolocated from just taking photos and videos and flying the drone. Next tier up, collecting 3D data. The 2 most common technologies for this are photogrammetry and LiDAR. Most people are using photogrammetry because it's much cheaper. Again, both in terms of time to learn and process and work with the data, as well as the actual cost of the equipment. So next slide, we're going to look at what we can get out of photogrammetry a bit. So photogrammetry uses a series of overlapping photographs, and it creates an actual accurate 3D model, point clouds, meshes, digital elevation models, that we can then take measurements and start planning on. So this is essentially a much higher resolution, more detailed version of what we can find online or what you would see in Google Earth. Accuracy, we could spend a whole webinar on, so I'm just gonna kind of list a couple of the bullets there, but we can spend a whole webinar just on accuracy of photogrammetry. So what we get out of photogrammetry is a variety of deliverables. Next. And so first is orthorectified high resolution imagery. Orthorectified is just a fancy way of basically saying it's been corrected or flattened out for the curvature of the Earth and for distortion from the photo lenses. When I say high resolution, a lot of times for trail projects, we're flying at sub-inch resolution. So if we zoom way in, usually we're at 0.5 to 0.6 inches for each little pixel in there. Next. Digital elevation models. So similar to the imagery, except instead of color, we have elevations. This project, you can see we are collecting both the trees and buildings to start with. Next. And we can filter those out. So then for this one, we didn't really care about the building, so we didn't bother filtering those out. They're still blobby, but down in the canyon where we're working, we filtered out all the trees and vegetation to get to a bare ground elevation model. Next. Can pull contours. These are 1 foot contours from that data set. 3D point cloud. This is a truly 3D data set now. So this is usually tens or hundreds of millions of points. Each one has a point in space and a color, and we get this accurate 3D model that we can start doing design from. We can also take that to a 3D mesh on the next slide, which is what we would take into 3D modeling software like SketchUp or Blender, other 3D modeling softwares. Next. And one that gets overlooked a lot because this is in the processing software, but we get a 3D site inventory. So it lets anyone working on the project, no matter where they are in the world or what time it is, to really be able to investigate and do analysis on the project without having to return to the site. Next. So this is a video. I think it'll play for you guys. Might lag a little bit, but this is the same project that I was showing you a lot of the screenshots of just before. And this shows we can get really pretty good data. This is the point cloud. I think we're at 0.6 inch resolution or so. So every point from point to point is about ½ an inch or a little bit more. And you can see even with a decent amount of vegetation for Western US, we can get really good data underneath and around the trees. One limitation of photogrammetry is as you get into much more dense vegetation like rainforest or on the East Coast, you're going to have a lot less information under the trees. And we can go to the next slide if it pauses here. Yep. So next category, we've collected all of this data, and now how do we work with it? So how do we take it back to the office and start doing planning and design? Next. Our biggest tool is probably GIS, and when I say biggest, I mean most common, most frequently used. Two main GIS programs, QGIS and ArcGIS, which is made by Esri. Esri is kind of the big powerhouse who makes ArcGIS. It's the industry standard. QGIS is free. It's amazing software. Personally, my company, we do pay for Esri. Has good tools, but we actually end up using QGIS probably 90% plus of the time just because the interface makes a lot of sense. But we're bringing all those data sets that we've collected from drone, from planometers, from field notes, from online data sources into GIS, and then creating trail and planning design line work with attributes. Next. Sometimes we use AutoCAD software, definitely not every project, but certain projects that make sense for more detailed design on features. Adobe products, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Premiere really lets us mark up photos, drone or otherwise, make illustrations, graphics that help communicate either site assessment or our design intent. Next. 3D modeling, kind of like CAD, we certainly don't use it on every project, but there are definitely projects that we do use it on. Next. The other thing I always like to tell people with this toolbox is you're combining tools. So for example, that 3D model that we collect in drones, we can bring into a 3D software, modeling software like SketchUp. So on the next slide, this one, everything that's kind of white grid is collected by drone. It's a 3D photogrammetry model. And then the trail and the bridge, we designed and built in 3D in the actual one-to-one scale model in SketchUp. And so then on the next slide, you can see we get to finish renderings that are great for communicating design intent, site restrictions, everything about the site that we're thinking through. Next. We can also upload the 3D models to online platforms. This one's called Pix4D Cloud. So this is a totally different project than the other pictures, but on this one, the client is much more versed in trail design than a lot of our other clients. So they're doing flagging, they're doing planning and design. We're able to upload our drone photogrammetry model, and then collaboratively over the internet, we can both be working on trail design and trail notes. Next. Final category, presentation and sharing tools. So on the next slide, you can see a variety of different graphics. We've collected all of this data. We've created trail line work. We've probably created planning diagrams. We've done photo markups. Maybe we've even done video editing, but how do we share them with the clients and stakeholders? So I'm just going to go through a few of those tools that we use today. The next slide, the first one I want to show you is simple PDFs. So of course, you can make a PDF from a Word document, but if you go into Adobe InDesign, you can make a much nicer looking report like this. And it's not just about looking nice, it's about being able to visually communicate. So being able to use photos, GIS maps, and text all together, along with maybe even 3D models and renderings, help communicate, again, site assessment or trail design decisions. Also helps go after funding. A lot of times our trail projects are only funded through a design phase, and we need to get that funding for final construction. Next. Online sharing. So Esri makes two really good online data sharing things. There's actually more than two, but it's all contained within what they call WebGIS. And we use web maps and web apps the most. Essentially, it's being able to share those GIS maps online so that somebody can interact with the map. They can turn layers on and off. They can zoom in and out, pan around, but it's better than just a static PDF. Next. The other Esri online tool we use a lot is Story Maps. It's basically a fancy website where we can have photos, videos, GIS maps, 3D models, but it's all interactive and it lets us guide stakeholders through our narrative, through our decision-making process. Next. So again, with the toolbox, I just like to reiterate, you have this huge amount of tools and it's going to grow the more projects you do. So every project, look at what your end goal is and how you're going to use the data and let that influence which tools and techniques you choose for the project. With that, I believe I'll hand it back over to Jeremy.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And I hope that was, I always love watching John talk and all these great tools that he shares. They're certainly, I hope folks are jumping around in their heads and thinking about how those can be used in planning and design, as well as the communications piece, which are really critical to these projects being successful. Yeah, so thank you, John. We are going to change now kind of to our third act here and talk a little bit about trail project life cycle, or kind of like the life phases that these projects go through. And I want to just spend a little bit of time on this slide talking about, we're looking at think of it as a Gantt chart. We've got time on our x-axis here moving forward as the project moves forward. We've got these kind of overlapping and stacked life phases or cycles for our projects. And this is like an idealized version of what this can look like. And I think there's some traits that I want to highlight here that really can help contribute to either shortening your overall timeline, moving from like ideation through construction and moving into that maintenance and management phase, or help you avoid some pitfalls along the way with lessons learned from projects in the past. But as we start thinking about these, we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail on the next couple slides, but looking at how these things overlap in this idealized phase, and recognize that a lot of successful projects, they all certainly moved through these phases of life as they went from idea to implementation, but some of them went more linearly. They did planning and then design and then permitting, then approvals and then construction. But this is just hopefully an illustration of how we can be moving these phases forward and thinking about the future phases early in the project to line these things up so that they can move forward a little more efficiently. So with that, let's go through each of these individually, and we'll talk more about this diagram as we transition to some example projects. So in that first phase, we're talking about planning. We often hear about conceptual plans, master plans, site plans. There's all these different terminology that gets thrown around. And in the trails world, we really like to think about master planning is kind of this narrative 30,000-foot view. So we focus on some of those resources I outlined in the first section. Who are our partners? What are the lands we have? What is the terrain, the hydrology, the soils? Describing the landscapes we're working with, the property management and ownership. And so looking at that, looking into the regulatory space, as well, and then describing what is the potential for this. So this is a master plan. These two photos or two images are dragged out of a master plan we did for the Elkins area shared trails in Elkins, West Virginia earlier this year. This was originally 3 properties that we were looking at, and you can see those in the map there. But we went through this master planning effort with the partners, engaging with the university. Davidson-Elkins College is one of the landowners, state of West Virginia, and the local community own the other 2, either in holding with a private partner that's willing to do trails or on their own. And we identified a 4th project that was an existing city park during that master planning effort. Where that map really highlights the characteristics of those trails, or the potential trails that could be developed, the conceptual trails that could be developed on those landscapes, describes the purpose and the goals and the specifications for those in a lot more detail through the master plan. But it really focuses at that narrative level and outlines steps to move that forward. And that's what a good conceptual or a good master plan will do. It keeps the narrative at that higher level, the lines on the map can start being used, thinking about that permitting phase, getting those out to the land manager, getting those out to the state and regional conservation districts to see what kind of concerns they might have from a natural cultural resources or land disturbance. If we're making trails, we are doing some sort of land disturbance. So what types of regulatory space will be working in as we get into that later life phase. But these master plans are great in that they provide fantastic materials to start fundraising around, start marketing a project to the public, making sure that they had input in the master plan, hopefully, but that they can continue to communicate with the community and beyond about the vision for the project and garner political and or financial support. They open the door for that permitting and opportunity for partner review. And they also serve as kind of a course budget placeholder. So we can look at the potential for this many miles of trail, approximate costs associated with developing that and putting that on the ground. And then as we move through the later life cycles, those budget numbers can get a little more refined. Then we'll see how the design refines as well. Next slide. So as we think about design, so we went to master planning on that last slide. The next phase is design, and we have that stacked in our diagram, overlapping with planning. Certainly, there's a feasibility phase that starts at the ideation phase of this prior to planning, but making sure that we have a partner that wants to work with us to make trails happen, and that the landscape's appropriate and suitable for what the vision is. But that all gets sorted out in that planning level, and we take that conceptual plan that comes out of a master planning process, and we might have something that looks like this kind of wide orange corridor. We know we want to connect that house at the top that we can see in some of that LiDAR data. And we know that we want to access this stream, and this is kind of our original conceptual level, corridor level design. Often that's done using those tools that John just outlined, the data that they collect or the publicly available data, and then using that digital GIS environment to the planning. Follow that up with a field design phase. And so next slide, I think we'll have a yellow line drop on here. And so our field design gets out, walks the landscape, uses those digital data often on our phones and other tools. We can carry that out with us with tablets and phones and GPS devices. We go out there and we refine that corridor. We'll learn that our data gave us a lot of great guidance, but we also learn from the landscape that that trail corridor needs to shift around a bit. These are typically at this phase flagged and GPSed, and we're also collecting data on the specification. So if we are making a stream crossing, for example, we'll start to get some of those approximate dimensions for the stream, the location, and notes about that can feed into that next phase of permitting. And then finally, we have a final design. And depending on how a project is implemented, if we're going to have a project built with all volunteers, this final design is really a critical step. And so we go out and work ahead of the hand crews that are going to be doing the work. And we would pin flag that actual trail corridor, and we'll write on those the actual trail tread location within that corridor for them to build. We can write right on the pin flags. This is a drain dip. This is the top of a grade reversal. All those kind of details that need to go into managing volunteer and hand-built trail. If it's going through a professional contractor, a PTBA, or other professional trail contracting or in-house professional trail resource with your agency, often that design can stop at the field design level. It can delineate the center line of that yellow corridor that we're seeing on the map and allow the final design to be implemented by the professional within a given corridor, plus or minus 50 feet or so. And again, that all feeds into the permitting phase. So we need to define that corridor so that we can be successful in the permitting and ultimately approval of our permits. There was a webinar, I think a month ago, and I think Candace is going to provide some links in the chat to that, but there was a webinar a bit ago about permitting if you want to get in the weeds on this a bit more. But just recognizing that this phase of the project of a life cycle of a trail project is often, it's one of those things we get through planning, we get through design, and then we say, oh, shoot, now we need to do permits. So starting this one earlier in the process, sometime early in planning, getting out with the land manager, get out with your county conservation or your regional state level conservation district and introduce them to the details of the project you're going to work on. Often natural surface trails see a big hiccup in the permitting approval space. A lot of folks in these permitting offices aren't familiar with narrow natural surface trail. So if that's what you're building, make sure you can communicate that to your permitting office, because that'll help you streamline the permitting process. When they understand what's being done and that you're not going in and grading a railroad grade or a greenway style trail development in the middle of the woods, they can be a lot more flexible in the way they apply their permitting requirements to you. But there are national, state, and local regulatory spaces you should be aware of early in your process. And obviously, as your project scales and the complexity of these, if you're impacting surface waters or crossing streams that have certain characteristics, you're going to have higher permitting thresholds than projects that avoid streams and are under a certain threshold of disturbance. And you can see there the national, the NPDES, the NIFTY, some people call it, that permit. Anytime you disturb more than an acre in aggregate on your whole trail, on your whole project, given construction project. So think of it as a trail, which is about, if you get above 2 miles of trail or so, you're going to be hitting that threshold pretty quickly. You will need to coordinate with your office and apply for an NPDES permit. Next slide. And so this is the exciting phase, move into construction. Permitting happened, get approvals. If we're working with a federal land manager, we might have to go through a NEPA process and work on an EA or an EIS, depending on the level of the project. But as we start moving towards construction, we really want to think about this phase early. When we're doing our planning and design, we might not have to go all the way to that green line we looked at in the design phase. If we know that we're going to work with professional contractors to build this, we can probably stop at that corridor level design, let the permitting use that as its basis to move forward. But typically, once we are looking like we're going to get greenlit for permits, we can start the construction sequence. So this starts with developing construction documents and the solicitation and materials if we're going to put this thing out to bid, and then soliciting that, having pre-bid conversations with potential contractors to get a better understanding. Sometimes these involve site work or site visits for pre-bid site visits, so folks can see that they're getting into big rocky coastline, as we see here with a photo from OVP TrailWorks. And then we receive the bids, the entity, the fiscal agent, if it's a partner or a land managing agency, they receive the bids. There will be, often depending on the funding that goes into a project, there are different requirements and around that award and solicitation that need to be followed closely, especially if you're working with a grant. You don't want to find out that you made an award in a way that the grant will no longer let you get reimbursed for. So making sure you're following those guidances and have a successful solicitation and then award, develop a contract with the firm that's going to do construction, or multiple firms in some cases, as we'll see. And then manage that. Just having the contract in place is not where the work there stops. So making sure that you have the partners and the permitting agencies out there to kick the project off, so everyone's on the same page with whose responsibilities lie where with respect to the project, and scheduling inspections, approvals of work, and so forth, with punch lists and payments to follow. And that's a key piece as we think about that organizational capacity, particularly in fiscal capacity. A lot of these projects end up costing quite a bit of money. Most of our grants are going to be reimbursement grants, which means the payment needs to be made to the contractor, and then the grant will reimburse later. So making sure that you are thinking about that as you think about your inspection and pay apps, and how big of a check can you write and float while you're waiting for your grant reimbursement, and how does that cycle work if you have multiple contractors. So building that organizational capacity into this phase of the work and understanding that is also very important. And the work really doesn't stop until the trailers are done. We can have trail opening. A lot of times we have a permitting window that extends beyond the construction phase until kind of the site is stabilized. And so there's need to document the permit compliance, there's need to document your grant compliance and close those out, as well as to document the as-built conditions. And then that can give you some data to put into signage and other components of the project. Next slide. And a step that we always want to think about, we're just constructing a trail and then it's open. I want to make sure that folks register that maintenance and management need to be part of the planning effort and the life cycles of these projects. So making sure that as we bring new trail, or we update or redevelop trails, or even if we're just doing a maintenance project, making sure that we're building skills and capacity and identifying who and how these trails are going to be taken care of into the future, whether that's developing a formal operations and maintenance plan, or doing some training alongside the construction effort, but building those resources into the local stewardship committee or community and the partners and the land manager as well, so that these things can be done and coordinated, whether it's inspections of structures like the bridge that we saw in John's hybrid 3D and virtual space as that thing is constructed, or if we're coordinating just for seasonal closures. We work with trail systems that close seasonally for poor soil conditions through the winter, for example, repairs, safety issues, others such as that we need to be able to get out there and keep an eye on these things and manage those. Next slide. So circling back to this diagram, and I'll spend a little bit of time here, just we can certainly do these things sequentially, and we've seen a lot of great, very successful projects. Jake's Rocks in Northwest Pennsylvania, for example, went through a planning and a design phase, kind of collectively in this, as it's shown here, and then we had a long pause with permitting before that project did some additional fundraising and permitting, and so we kind of stretched that timeline out. Certainly a very successful project. And I think just want to highlight that this is like the idealized schedule of moving through a project. And just because you might not have the organizational capacity, or the land manager you're working with might have some restrictions on their bandwidth that don't allow you to hit this ideal, doesn't mean your project's dead in the water. But it's a good one to just kind of keep this in mind. And as you're in planning, make sure you think about permitting. As you're in design, let's be thinking about how are we getting this ready for construction? Are we building this with volunteers? Are we bidding this out? And what level of design do we need to take this through? As well as that maintenance and management. And then underpinning that, the fundraising and the communications piece. I think if there's one thing that we've seen on successful projects of all scales, having communication at the appropriate level and the fundraising piece kind of underpinning this, and making sure that you're capturing great information, graphics that can help with that outreach and communication and fundraising as you move along are really key. So developing that as part of your organizational capacity will help you move through these cleanly and get to a point where your projects are ultimately successful. Great. We've got a next slide. We're going to go through two projects now just to kind of illustrate some of what we shared here, and then we do have time for Q&A here at the end, and it looks like we're close to on schedule. So I'm going to talk briefly about a project I played a very small role in, but as part of the team that worked on what's the Minnesota Iron Range. This was a redevelopment and development of new trails at 3 sites across Minnesota's Iron Range, moving from southeast Grand Rapids, Minnesota, up to Chisholm. The site we're looking at in this photo is the Redhead Mountain Bike Park outside of Chisholm, near Bob Dylan's childhood home, I think, there in Hibbing or Chisholm. And then moving to the northwest, Giants Ridge is a ski hill area that had been developed previously through the IRRB, which is the Iron Range Rehabilitation Board that levies a lot of different projects out of mine-related funding to try and help with a lot of these communities were boom and bust cycles with iron mining. And then so they developed golf courses and a ski hill up at Giants Ridge previously through similar efforts. And then they took on this mountain bike trail development across these 3 sites. And then they updated an additional site. They include in this Ride the Range, the Cuyuna Lakes region, which had started being developed as a mountain bike destination, I think in the mid-2000s, early 2000s to 2014 or so. It's 145 plus miles of trail up on the Iron Range. 80 of that was built in 2.5 seasons of construction. So pretty rapid development of the 3 sites that I mentioned there, the Tioga at Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the one we're looking at, Redhead, and the Giants Ridge additions to the system they had there, really in 3 summers. And so next slide. As we look at that, the roots of that project prior to really the planning, the on the ground planning and design phases that started in 2018, which is late 2018 is when I got involved in the project a little bit as part of a broad team. There were roots in this area in the past. The Cuyuna Lakes had been being developed with partners there over the last 10 years prior. And then around 2014, 2015 or so, folks started eyeing this project. There was a state regulation about going inside of a mine fence. So this site was fenced off. This is an old mine site. And for years, no one was allowed legally inside the mine fencing. So they had to change that at the state level to get access to these lands to put trails on them. So that took several years. And there was also a state procurement hurdle that they wanted to move through. So they on these projects, the state worked to have a pre-vetted pool of contractors to do construction on this project. So they knew they wanted to build this rapidly. They spent about $5 million over those 3 summers, and they had 11 to 13 different different trail construction companies pre-qualified to do that work. And they had a pretty unique model where folks were paid based on the duration of their work. It wasn't like a typical lump sum or per unit price for trail constructed, which took a higher level of construction management and a lot of permitting support. This group, there were regional mountain bike clubs and local mountain bike clubs that contributed to this. There was the state, the IRRB, and a lot of folks that had hands in this. They ended up working with a local engineering firm to really support the permitting part of this and stormwater inspections that had to happen. You can imagine with 13 different contractors running around with multiple crews, whenever there was a rain event, permit inspections had to happen during the construction phase. And so that local regional environmental office had some connections through one of the mountain bike clubs, but was very instrumental in helping support kind of large scale development like this in the condensed build. And I'll just add, the projects often would kind of go through these life cycles, and then we might have a second phase. So when we think about scaling, don't think of your projects as moving through this life cycle once and you're done. You may identify in your master plan a huge project like this one, and you want to bite it off in smaller phases and move each phase successfully through and build those skills and capacity. The Redhead site that we're looking at here, they just announced a fundraising campaign, I think in 2022, and they successfully hit their goal of $2 million. They went over there with $2.25 million for expansion of that trail system here in the next couple of years. And I think I'm handing it off to John to talk on the Denver University.
Perfect. Yeah. So in contrast to gigantic, huge monster of a project that Jeremy was talking about, I want to talk to you about a much smaller, much quicker project and what the design and planning process looked like for that. So here in Colorado, University of Denver purchased a property as their mountain campus. They're integrating it into their curriculum. They're also making it so every new student at DU spends a long weekend up at the campus learning about wilderness and environment. It's basically their welcoming weekend. So this project, in contrast to 150 plus miles, is basically, we broke off just 3 miles to start with. They really need to do more of a master plan for the whole site, and they're doing some of that within their own staff, but they had a real immediate need to have some usable trails for students. By the time we got under contract, they already had students staying at the property, so they were kind of almost behind where they needed to get a trail as soon as possible. So we identified 3 trails that made up about 3 miles. It's one continuous trail, but 3 segments that are really independently used if they need to be. And we went from concept to final flagging in less than 2 months, and then construction can go into that pending contracting right after. Because we're spending so much time on site, we also decided to start doing kind of an overall high-level assessment, map the entire property, and then that assessment serves as guidance for the master plan. It's beautiful property, have just kind of a string of photos across the bottom. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention I got my truck stuck worse than I've ever gotten any vehicle stuck on any property in my whole life. So that was a fun experience, first day of site visit up there. Next page. So planning, design, process-wise, we really did all the planning and design. Started in the office a bit, pulling as much data as we could, and then we spent about a week there on site, mapping the whole property, processing that mapping in the first night or 2, and then just doing tons of field work to really figure out where this trail could go, meet with the client, go back out in the field, make revisions. So it was really a very quick fire of OnX in the field to QGIS on the laptop to back to OnX in the field using Clinos, figuring out positive and negative control points, and then back to QGIS to get to this final plan. Approvals were pretty quick because it's a private client. Really no permitting or minimal permitting, state grading permit and not much else. And that was by design. So we specifically chose a trail in areas that would not have floodplain permitting, that would not be impacting rivers, that we wouldn't need to go after additional permitting to facilitate this really quick turnaround. Again, quick approvals, pretty neat trail, neat area, and so quick. So, less than 2 months from beginning to end for planning and design, and then being able to basically go into construction right after that, pending the contracting phase. And yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up for this little project. It's just kind of a nice contrast to the Iron Range one.
Great. Well, now I think we're going to move into Q&A. And then Candace, do you have a different slide you're going to put up? All right. Well, we have quite a lot of questions and, just a little bit of time, about 10 minutes. So I'm going to just direct questions to John and Jeremy. And then also thank you, John and Jeremy, for answering so many questions while we've been going along too. That's pretty awesome. So I was going to start with John. And there was a question about how do you address or weigh the liability aspect regarding whether or not to design and implement barriers, edge protection, potential hazards, steep drops, versus just adding signage. You saw the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I started typing up an answer and decided not to because I thought it was a really important one and wanted to answer it for everyone to hear. So liability is something that we look at with every project. That particular image in this one was a very early kind of conceptual design, so we weren't looking at those details, but liability is going to be different from every project, and it's really going to depend on the client as well. We can use International Building Code kind of as a guide. We can also use Forest Service guidelines as a guide, but trails are natural environments. So, we're inherently in a more risk-prone situation than walking on a sidewalk next to a building. So a lot of times we're looking at the intended use types and how many and what types of people are using. The liability for a private landowner using his own trail is much different than a public sector open space that's open to everyone. A lot of times in master plans, we'll also create maintenance, management, inspection plans that will outline how and when maintenance should be done, what you should be inspecting, ensuring that you're taking written logs of those inspections. And those are a really good way to limit liability, but really comes down to a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, John. Jeremy, I have a question for you. How does permitting carry over to post-construction on trail project life phases?
Great. Yeah, so permitting often specifies that the permits are open until a certain point. If you think about a traditional construction contract where they're doing a lot of land grading and they have silt fences up until grass is reestablished. So often we see a clause like that kind of the permit for the trail work will be held open until some duration afterwards, until the disturbed corridor and the disturbed land has renaturalized.
Great. I have another one for you, Jeremy. Do you incorporate MESA, so priority habitats, WPA, estimated habitats, biomap, and protection of sensitive wildlife habitats into trail planning?
Certainly, yeah. And that's, I think, a good master planning effort digs into all those nooks and crannies. And so you look at the landscape you're working with the land manager you're working with, and then you look at those state level resources and definitely want to do a good design process preemptively is looking into that permitting window. So if we know we have cultural, natural, or wildlife resource that we need to protect, there's no need to go out and hang flags right through habitat that we know is going to come back in the review process and say, oh, did you think about this? So doing that early is very important to kind of compressing those timeframes. A project we did in Southeast Ohio with the National Forest, the Wayne National Forest, soon to be Buckeye National Forest, was 88 miles of trail on 12,000 acres. And at the kickoff of that meeting, the forest supervisor had the botanists and the biological staff and the hydrologists and the soils and cultural resource folks in the room to communicate with the planning and design team, as well as the partner on that, which was Athens Bicycle Club, about their concerns ahead of time, so that design process could move forward with already knowing some of the things to avoid, or also some of the things to be looking for as you're on the landscape. So yeah, great question.
All right, and John, is there a way to do 3D modeling with data gathered with video taken from the ground, not with a drone?
So in short, yes. Ideally, it's with photos rather than video, because when you do it from video, it's taking screenshots, frame shots out of the overall video. You do still need photos or videos that are geotagged. So Pix4D actually makes a free app. It's called Pix4D Catch, C-A-T-C-H, and it'll use your phone. I believe it's Android or iPhone. I know it's definitely on iPhones. The app is free, and basically it'll let you map areas. It doesn't work for really large areas, but definitely trail features or small areas. And it's recording the location of the photos just like a drone does. Now you do still need to either upload it to Pix4D Cloud or import the photos into any other photogrammetry software, which typically do cost money to process it. But yeah, it doesn't have to be from a drone. Just has to be from cameras that you know that record the geolocation of.
So John, kind of following up on that, in terms of if you're using a drone, there's quite a few questions about recommended drones for collecting ortho imagery or minimum drone requirements. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So minimum drone requirements, really it's a drone with a camera and GPS that can record the location. The most common ones, and all the drones I use, are DJI. They're simply the most reliable and most capable drones that are out there right now. And it's a wide range. So you could use, I think I saw a question about specifically DJI Mavic consumer grade drones. Absolutely can use them for photogrammetry. So we at my company use 4 different drones, ranging from a little tiny one that's about this one to a huge one that is 3 giant cases. And if I can't drive to where I'm flying from, I can't use it. So which drone I use, one depends on where I'm needing to fly from. If it needs to fit into my backpack so I can bike or hike somewhere, I'm using something like a Mavic consumer grade drone. If I can drive to where I'm taking off from, then I'll usually use that big drone just because it has a much bigger camera. And it also has bigger batteries. So I can stay in the air longer and I can be further away from the subject and get the same or better quality of data. So again, DJI drones are kind of the leader. Drone that has GPS on it and a camera. Pretty much all the DJI ones are also come ready to fly. So you have the drone, the camera, the controller, all of it's there. So you don't have to piecemeal different things together.
Great. And I guess we'll do one more question. And this will be for Jeremy. There's a couple of questions about, do you adjust your planning process, like from all the pieces you talked about, based on user, whether it's horses, walkers, bicyclists?
Yeah, definitely. The use type that's identified for a trail can change a lot of the different parameters. John was talking about the great data they have and like how steep can a trail be, depending on the type of use and the amount of use that you want to have, and also the mix of uses that you want to put on the landscape. There are definitely parameters that you would change with the specifications. So a lot of the research has shown, motorized and equestrian are some of our higher impacting uses on trails. So we try and maintain those put them on soils that are rockier, that are more durable, and minimize grade, as well as more frequent grade reversals with those types of use. But thinking about more modern, we've got folks out there on one wheels and e-bikes and e-mountain bikes. There's definitely a lot of energy in that space, working to better understand some of these new technologies and how they're affecting the way that folks recreate and behave on the landscape, and then feeding that back into these systems so that we can improve management and design so that we have sight lines that work better for either higher closing speeds if we're looking at motorized uses getting onto our trails, or just managing so that folks can still experience solitude in a more wilderness type of trail experience, making sure that we have zones built into our plan that accommodate the diversity of use we want to see.
Great, thanks. All right, I guess that's all we have time for questions. And I'm sorry there are so many questions in there, but I'm going to hand it over to Candace right now.
Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you, John and Jeremy. Such great information. A lot of questions that we're not able to get to due to timing, but definitely encourage you to reach out to the presenters. Their emails are going to be shared in my follow-up email. And of course, I had their emails on my last slide, but I'll get their emails to you guys within a couple of days if you have any follow-up questions, or definitely reach out to us and we'll get that info for you. So again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to PTBA for partnering with us on this webinar, and also thank our webinar partner, Mass Trails, as well as our additional webinar partners that include Camelot Tools, Drs. Elizabeth and Greg Berger, Poly Products, the Trail Safe Passing Plan, Stop, Speak, and Stand Back, Black Diamond Trail Designs, Presto Geosystems, Outer Spatial, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the USDA Forest Service. This slide you will also get in my follow-up email with the links, to last month's webinar, as well as everything else that's on there. And if you are enjoying these webinars, please consider donating as little as $5 by texting I'm for Trails to 44321. To celebrate our highest attended webinar to date, actually, I will be selecting a handful of winners that donate immediately following this webinar to receive our Trail Boss mug, as well as our Happy Trails coaster and stickers as a thank you. And lastly, we hope you'll be able to join us for next week's webinar in our Advancing Trails webinar series. It's free and you can register for it today. And all of our webinars, including this webinar recording, are available on the American Trails YouTube channel at youtube.com/American Trails. So thank you everyone again for attending. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your